I'm not going to speak very much, so I don't want to mess with this. All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jessica Gaitan Johannesson. I work for Lighthouse, and I have the huge pleasure of hosting this evening the launch of Ace Voices by Eris Young. I feel like that in itself is just woo! It's such a beautiful book, and say just as I'm sure most, like many of you know, it's been a bit of a rarity to find good writing in this country specifically, I think, about aspec perspectives and experiences and aromantic experiences. So this book is definitely very welcome, but it is also welcoming. And it's one of the things that I really loved about it, that it feels inclusive, it feels like there is space for everyone in it. It asks lots of questions, not necessarily having prescriptive answers, which is also really lovely. So we're here to celebrate it. And we're going to start by inviting two guest writers onto the stage before we invite Eris. So Eris will be like you feel their presence, but they will not appear on the stage until a little bit later. First of all, we've got the huge delight of welcoming Lewis Brown. Lewis is a Newcastle-based poet who likes to write queer poems, comic poems, and spooky poems. Currently, he's writing a lot about aromantic love, which is queer, comic, and spooky all at the same time. Like all poets, he craves your validation, but would never admit it. So you can find out more about Lewis at Should Have Sent a Poet on Instagram. Let's all put our hands together to welcome Lewis Brown.
Give me a minute to adjust this. It's working. Yes. Good. Perfect. Right. Breathe. All the people that I love now will turn to stone at 50. And nobody I've yet to meet will care for me at all. I will lose all of my hobbies. Not even a pastime will remain. And as a culture, we will unanimously shun our elders. It seems unlikely, but this can be the only explanation. Otherwise, we really, only me by osmosis, wouldn't be so worried about having no one to grow old with. Thank you. Now, I led with that one. Also, hi, everyone. Hello, I'm Lewis. I'm aromantic and asexual, and this sometimes comes up in my poems, as you might have guessed. And yeah, the reason I led with that poem is because it makes it easier for me to explain one of my favorite words, which is heterotemporality. Gotta get ooh. I like it because it sounds complicated, but you can tell what it means, right? It's the straight people life plan, right? You know, the one that goes first date, going steady, have sex at some point, engagement, get married, 2.5 kids, buy a house, white picket, all that stuff, that stuff. Now, you don't have to actually even be asexual or aromantic for that life plan to not be for you, right? You don't even have to be queer. It's just, well, it's not for everybody. And who can really buy a house with only one partner these days, right? Monogamy in this economy? I don't think so. But it's both terrifying and exciting to realize that the only happy ending that your culture really recognizes might not be for you. It's scary, but it's also means you can kind of do whatever the fuck you want, which is pretty fun. You know, it's like someone much smarter than me kind of compared it to being a Time Lord, which I think is quite cool. Yeah, with that in mind, it was really hard to narrow down which poems to do this evening at this wonderful event. I want to tell you about my experience of relationships. I want to tell you about how I realized that straight kids don't normally choose who to fancy by like knocking people down in like you're playing a game of Guess Who and going, oh, not that one. Oh, not that one. Oh, I guess this is the only person left, right? I don't think that's the normal straight experience, but I could be wrong. And like, I want to talk about how like, even the loveliest straight allies, sometimes you want to grab them by the shoulders and go, no, you don't get it. You don't get how exciting this is. You know, you're just very sort of polite and understanding, but I want you to be excited as well. But in the interest of not overwhelming everybody, and not taking too much time away from the lovely Jo and Alice, who you'll discover soon, I've narrowed it down to two more poems. And they both have something to do with the straight life plan. One is a pretty political one about the people who do not like it when you decide that you're not going to follow, when you're not going to stick to the plan. And then the one after that is much lighter. So if this next one is a bit heavy, don't worry. We'll get through it together. Where are we? Okay. I do have some content warnings for this one. It features aphobia and queerphobia, quite a lot of phobias in general, online abuse, and mainstream British journalism, which might be the most egregious of all of them. Okay, let's go. I wish that International Asexuality Day was a day for celebration. And I suppose it is that. It is a day for education and advocacy and kindness. But it is also another thing. Open season. See, this is when the hateful hang up their dog whistles and join their voices in chorus. Subtlety is not needed now, there is blood in the water. They say, not wanting sex does not make you special. They say, look at me, I don't like football, where's my oppression medal? They say, you're making it up, you just want attention. They say, it's sick and disgusting to teach this to children. They say, why does she dress like that if she doesn't want sex? They say, they'll add bestiality to the acronym next. They say, another new grift from the Stonewall cabal. They say, LGBT, XYZ, I just can't keep track of it all. They say, this is what happens when you let the gender cultists mutilate kids. They say they make up asexuality to hide what they did. They say must have been abused as a child, poor dear. They say, I'm sick of all these straight people trying to be queer. They say asexual people don't face any threats. They say you just haven't been fucked by the right person yet. They say a lot of things over and over until it forms one continuous sound. This is the sound of hammer and nails being taken to the closet door. The sound that makes the slow death of invisibility preferable to being seen. Well, that is what they want it to be. What it is, what this sound is the bawling of a spoiled child as it realizes the next generation of grown-ups are no longer listening. Thank you very much. I don't really enjoy doing that one, but you know, it bears saying sometimes. Like, I'm very glad to tell you that most people aren't like that, you know, but most people don't think like that. Most people are pretty chill and nice, but there are some people out there with pretty big platforms that do think like that. And like ace people don't really need to be told that there's people out there that think like that, but sometimes allies don't really get it, don't really get why it's important. To have like good representation and the conversation, they don't really get why we need it. So I think it does bear saying sometimes. But with that in mind, I also don't think it bears to dwell too much on the negatives. And also I think it's quite interesting. Someone once pointed out to me like, oh, how do you feel about using labels that primarily define you in a negative. So say, aromantic, not interested in romance, asexuality, not interested in sex. Okay, that's very oversimplifying what they actually mean. But how do you feel about that? And I was thinking that is interesting. Like in a better world where you don't need to sort of carve a little space for yourself with these very useful terms, you might define yourself in terms of what you are oriented towards, what you do like, and that's what this one is about. So I'll leave you with this one, and then I'll leave you in the excellent care of the next two performers. Okay. I love you. Please keep your clothes on. I love you. Let's never kiss. I love you, and while I wouldn't personally initiate holding hands, I might be willing to meet you halfway on that one, depending on a multitude of factors, including mood, body temperature, and whether or not I am currently on the deck of a storm-tossed airship requiring me to cling to the handrail or risk being flung into the clouds below. I would risk it because I love you. I love our film nights. I love our video calls. I love our long walks in the park. I love our group photos. I love you. So let's buy clearance chocolate on the 15th of February and eat it ourselves because I love you. So let's go to the cinema and throw popcorn at the screen because I don't mean I love you the way they mean it when they say I love you. So let's buy half a dozen houses on the same street, get one cat and one dog and one of every streaming service and so many board games. Because I love you, all of you. Comfortable, queer, platonic. I love you with the heart I thought was broken. I love you in all the ways I thought were never good enough to say. I love you in all the ways they said were second best. I love you first and foremost anyway. First, foremost, poly-affectionate, you are all my one and only. With you, I will take no lovers and never be lonely except I love you in lockdown. Ugly, snot crying at 1 a.m. because I want to hug you, but when I can see you again, I love you, my friends. I do. I can't wait to show you. Thank you very much. Have a lovely night.
I realized that I just stole the book and just took it away with me. Thank you so much. That was so wonderful. Next up, we've got a second guest writer this evening, who is Jo Ross Barrett. Jo is a queer, asexual, polyamorous relationship anarchist. They have worked as an inclusion consultant and editor on hundreds of books, many by major publishers, and their writing has been published in 2 anthologies by Monsters Regiment, The Bible, Volume 1, and So Hormonal. Over the last year, they've started running their own business called Ace Inclusion Consultancy. A huge round of applause for Jo Ross Barrett.
Hi, everyone. And with me? Can you all hear me? Great. Okay, so I'm a writer and editor with a passion for championing inclusive content and policies. So I thought I'd use my stage time to discuss representing people on the asexual and aromantic spectrums, ASPEC for short. Some other key terms I'm going to use are allosexual and alloromantic for people who do typically experience those kinds of attraction, or allo for short. As a child, I was a keen reader. I was really privileged to see characters like myself in many of the books that I read. White, middle-class, able-bodied kids who went off on fantastic adventures. But ever since I was little, I was nonplussed by the norms around relationships that most narratives for older people would feature. Straight, romantic, sexual, monogamous relationships were treated as a universally shared goal that everyone should aim for in preference to other relationship types, taking precedence over loving bonds with family and friends. This focus on amorous relationships is called amatonormativity. It's a term coined by a philosophy professor called Elizabeth Brake in 2011. And the focus on straight relationships is called heteronormativity. So at best, these characters might have got along well and cared about each other, but most of the time it just felt like a forced addition that was put there because someone thought it ought to be there. Luckily, aside from the near omnipresent mum and dad in the background, most children's books were a lot less likely to drag allosexuality into the narrative for no reason. Most young protagonists were free from various attractions, so it was reasonably easy for me to tune out the real world pressures to conform. The older I got, though, the more overt those pressures became. By the end of junior school, many of the characters in the books I read were starting to act like amatonormative life really was inevitable. They fancied people, they pined after romance, and they made really illogical decisions because of it. And across over 1,000 books I read in my childhood, nearly every character was straight. And the 3 or 4 queer ones that I did spot were never the protagonists. Suddenly, the world of books wasn't as welcoming to me as it had once been. I was lucky that I had a strong sense of self, and I hadn't internalized the idea that my value as a person was based on my sexuality. Unlike many aspec people, I never believed that I was broken. I just thought most of my peers had really bizarre interests and priorities. I'd struggled to relate to many of them for years anyway, so it was just another difference between us to add to the ever-growing list. When I eventually found the term asexual online, it was validating to see that other people felt the same way. But it wasn't a massive relief to me that it was for some people. It took me longer to figure out my romantic orientation because I struggled to differentiate between romantic and platonic feelings, in no small part because those are arbitrary social constructs that mean different things to different people. But over time, I realized it doesn't really matter what the label is, so long as the relationship itself is good for the people involved. If you don't know what relationship anarchy is, I highly recommend Googling it at some point. So all of those experiences fed into my career as an inclusion consultant with a particular interest in media created for younger people. So if you have any content creators and editors in the audience, here's what you can do to help get great aspec representation into content. First, know your terms. Start with asexual or ace, and then look up demisexuality, grey asexuality or grey sexuality, and the many more specific micro labels out there. Really get to grips with the idea that sexual attraction and romantic attraction are different, even though many allo people will experience them simultaneously, so they're often conflated in media. It's important to have a basic awareness of these concepts so that you can recognize them when they come up and treat potential aspec characters with sensitivity and respect. Next, hire a consultant with lived experience of relevant aspec identities. I know it doesn't have to be me. Remember that they're there to help you, so listen carefully to their feedback and then implement it. Don't use aliens, magic creatures, or robots to avoid human aspec representation. The aspec community has had decades of minimal representation, and most often the characters with aspec traits just aren't human. And when no human characters have aspec traits, but these others like robots and magic beings do, the result is implicitly othering and dehumanizing aspec people. Of course, if humans don't feature at all in a piece of content, then apply this guidance to whatever sapient species the narrative tends to focus on. Call a spade a spade. Having a character who can be read as an authentic aspec person is fantastic, but it means the world if they actually identify that way in canon. You have to ask, is there any reason to leave it ambiguous, or are you just hoping you can get away with a less authentic portrayal if you don't overtly label the character? If the character prefers not to use a label, that's cool, of course. But why not have a scene where they talk about that with someone? And if you think that sounds unrealistic, you probably haven't experienced the lifelong process of coming out. By mentioning the words at all, you create an opportunity for someone to find out those traits aren't just a quirk of that character, but a shared part of wider human experience. Promote consent-based culture. There can often be a lot of pressure from allo people when it comes to performing romantic and sexual acts, and there needs to be a culture shift around this. Never portray coercive or violent behavior as acceptable. Normalize people talking about what they do and don't want to do in all kinds of social contexts, not just for relationship stuff. Sorry, folks, I had a very sore throat today. Show that attraction is not the same as action. Some of us have sexual and/or romantic relationships. Some of us don't. For allo people, attraction tends to precede the decision to start those kinds of relationships. For aspec people, our personal preferences and boundaries, along with those of anyone else in the relationship, tend to take precedence. There are plenty of aspec people out there who engage in romantic and/or sexual activities and enjoy them, or feel neutral about it, while others would hate doing so. It's a spectrum, and every individual is different. My personal biggest pet peeve in the industry is when people portray being aspec as inherently tragic or lonely, which was my first encounter with asexuality in a book ever. For those of us who want strong relationships, we've actually got a great chance of making that happen these days. Because in order to get to the point of identifying as aspec, we've usually done far more research on interpersonal relationships, romance, and sexuality than the average allo person, and definitely more than the average monogamous heterosexual heteroromantic person, which means we have better chances of explaining what we do and don't want in our relationships, which can save an awful lot of heartache. We are not doomed to die alone. Some of us enjoy solitude and others cultivate all kinds of relationships. So don't have your allo characters make pitying or mocking remarks about aspec characters unless you're using this to make a serious point about aphobic attitudes. Historical aspec representation, both fiction and non-fiction, can be more complex, but generally tragic elements tend to stem from amateur normativity, and isolation tends to stem from ignorance and lack of community, not from the aspec identity itself. Remember that sexuality can be fluid, but it can also be stable. You can have a character whose labels shift, meet a character whose labels stay the same, to avoid accidentally sending the message that any given identity is just a phase. Show the diversity of the aspec population. Check out the hashtag, "This is what asexual looks like," which was started by Black aspec activist and model Yasmin Benoit, to get an idea of the visual diversity of our community. The intersections between different aspects of our identities can mean we have very different experiences from one another. So do thorough research if you're not writing from personal experience, and always hire a consultant with relevant lived experience. Show that aspec people's lives are varied. The biggest stereotypical living situation is someone who lives independently by themselves, who has no significant others and no interest in finding them, and has no dependents except maybe a pet. While that's a totally valid lifestyle, it's also potentially a lazy shorthand that can reinforce stereotypes. Having multiple aspec characters lets you showcase some of the variety in our living situations. Represent aspec identities to everyone, including very young audiences. LGBTQIA+ people are not only for issue content or teen and up audiences. We're a part of every community, and we deserve to be portrayed as such in everyday life. Aspec identities and how they interact with relationships and desire can be explored in a huge variety of ways if you're given the representation of time in the narrative spotlight. Many members of very young audiences will automatically understand not experiencing romantic or sexual attraction because they have gone through life so far without feeling it either. Remember to include single adults of varied ages as fulfilled positive role models for younger people where you can. This will help them to imagine a wider range of futures for themselves without being as limited by amateur normativity. Make any aspec coding clear and unambiguous. So other queer identities often tend to be coded by a character's living situation or significant others, but this approach doesn't work as smoothly for aspec representation. After all, since attraction and action are different, these cues can simply read as in a relationship or single. Attraction can be conveyed through brief sentences such as, "I'm not interested in dating anyone. I don't fancy anyone. I hardly ever get crushes." Or, "I find people physically attractive, but I'm not interested in romance." However, this hyper-direct approach doesn't suit every context. Aspec pride flags and symbols can be a brilliant shorthand in text or visual cue in images that can convey how someone identifies. And this coding has the advantage of only outing the user to others who already know what aspec identities are, which saves them a lot of potential time and emotional labor on educating people. Finally, correctly identify the issues when we're discussing aspec identities in terms of social justice. Remember that the issues in question include amateur normativity, compulsory sexuality, conversion practices, rape culture, pathologization, aphobia, stereotyping, lack of education about aspec identities, lack of authentic aspec representation in media, and the lack of legal recognitions and protections for aspec people. Our existence itself is not an issue, and nor is increasing education about asexuality, aromanticism, and the rising number of people publicly identifying as aspec. These are just signs of aspec people feeling able to live more openly and authentically than they might have in the past. Overall, I hope to see a lot more high-quality aspec representation across all kinds of content in the future. More authentic representation leads to better understanding, both of ourselves and others, so I hope you'll join me in trying to push for more of it. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Jo, especially with a very sore throat. Well done. It is time to welcome onto the stage the author of Ace Voices. And I think of, Eris's role with this book as once you've read it, you feel like they're sort of holding so many voices and caring for them, which is really, really wonderful. You already know who Eris is, but I'm still going to introduce them properly. Eris Young is a queer transgender author of fiction and non-fiction. Their books, They, Them, Their, which is there to purchase if you so wish, and Ace Voices are published by Jessica Kingsley, and their short writings have appeared in Escape Pod, Fusion Fragment, The Scottish National, and others. They are fiction editor at Shoreline of Infinity Sci-Fi magazine, were the writer-in-residence at Lighthouse Bookshop from 2019 to 2022. In 2020, they received a Scottish Book Trust New Writers Award for fiction. We're going to hear a little reading from Ace Voices, so please join me in welcoming onto the stage Eris Young.
How's that? Yeah, cool. I'm going to take a little photo. Yeah, I mean, thank you all so much for coming here tonight. I'm really excited. I was literally agonizing, like, I think I dropped, maybe I accidentally dropped a bunch of hints to people, because anytime anyone would ask me, like, how are you feeling about Saturday? I'd be like, I'm afraid no one's going to show up. So, so if that's why you're here, sorry. Yeah, so I thought I would actually read a little bit of sort of further on in the book rather than the introduction. So this is an excerpt from the chapter about language. And well, you'll see. Lots of people I spoke to expressed a specific worry around detailed language used just for the sake of taxonomic accuracy. My interviewee, KL, summed it up nicely when explaining why they used ace instead of asexual. Ace feels more casual and less clinical. By writing this book, I don't want to give the impression that my definitions are the only ones, or that I own my community's language. That language has been created on purpose to be unresolved and not owned by any one person. That's why I take pains to say that these chapters are not glossaries. Trying to pin down a micro-label with a precise definition fails to capture the spirit of these words, but it's also potentially dangerous because it also depends on who is using the words. There's a long history in the West, at least, where the person who writes something down owns it. From monks dropping Christian themes and values into pagan tales, to the doctors who turned asexuality into a disease by giving it an entry in the diagnostic manual. Technically accurate words have been applied to my community by outsiders with the intention of categorizing and fixing us, rather than allowing asexuality to simply be an essential part of who we are. Terms such as hypoactive sexual desire disorder have been and still are used by medical professionals to take away our sexual and bodily agency. In these cases, words have caused real harm. Seen in this light, the stakes surrounding me writing this book seem somewhat higher. It has become accepted practice for writers from both inside and outside the queer community to write explainers of various parts of that community. Dictionaries in which newfangled language around gender and sexuality are unpacked and repackaged for the consumption of the reader. My own first book somewhat fits that model, though I did my best to allow for the messiness and nuance of identity. But knowing the complex history in which my identity, asexual, has been turned into a dictionary entry, and in which people like me have been displayed on TV to entertain an audience, I've become wary of dictionaries and what they represent. I can't help but draw a parallel in my mind between a dictionary in which each subcategory of A-spec experience is pinned down, neatly bounded by a concise definition, and a display case, a cabinet of curiosities where I and everyone in my community are arranged for the delectation of an allo public. I can't, in good conscience, allow this book to fall into that mold. Over and over while writing, I've had to think about my own place at the intersection of observer and observed. I've questioned my own role in writing a book that offers up my community to the public eye. I've questioned my own instincts and research methods and thought processes, which, for better or for worse, are shaped by my academic and scientific training. I've second-guessed everything from my use of questionnaires and statistics to my decision to try and provide definitions at all. The community itself is keenly aware of the difference between labels that we have claimed for ourselves and labels that have been put on us without our consent. Just look at the creation of agosexual in response to autocorosexual. In these cases, we must ask ourselves what and who words are for. My experience of attraction and sexuality is private, and most of us are not comfortable with being, as the authors of Asexualities put it, objects of scholarly scrutiny. I have no doubt that writing the explainer would have been easier. It's easier to create methodical, clear-cut categories to say, these people are asexual, and here's what that means, without ambiguity or context. But this approach doesn't exist in a vacuum, and I don't have the luxury of scientific distance. No one writing about my community, aware of its history, should have that luxury. Instead, I've tried to seek nuance, to allow uncertainty to flourish, even to celebrate it. In the face of so much pressure to explain ourselves, pressure to be certain, the ease with which so many aspec people hold on to the ambiguity, blurriness, and changeability of human experience is both a strength and a radical act. Bringing experiences like aromantic and agosexual into the English language is to declare that there is space for the people they describe. In creating language to use amongst ourselves, we aren't making up labels. Instead, we're trying to create space where interstitial, undefined, transitory, or fluid aspects of our experience can be allowed to exist. But at the same time, the power of our language lies in the way it is constantly and collaboratively growing and changing. To put something down on paper is to lend it permanence and rigidity, and by definition, this fails to capture its fluidity. With each step the aspec community takes into the light of visibility and mainstream acceptance, we will have to continually navigate this tension. Perhaps ironically, both the impulses I describe above, the development of neologisms to declare and even celebrate a marginalized set of experiences, and the rejection of precise taxonomic language feel very aspec to me. Our community is characterized by a radical and nuanced use of language, carving out spaces that have until now been marginal or non-existent, but also characterized by a comfort with ambiguity. There is power in naming yourself, but there is also power in being unnameable. Thank you.
Now everyone. Suit costs £10. Yeah, that's a fantastic, fantastic suit. Is it? Can you hear me? Yeah, kind of. Oh yeah, that's.
I can just hold it. I don't want to break it.
Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. I feel like there's so much to talk about in this book, and we were saying that earlier. And it's like we could talk about for ages. So it's like I'm just going to be very, in some ways, quite selfish, I suppose, and just go with things that have stuck with me loads of reading. Yeah, exactly. So, but still, I think it'll be really interesting to know a little bit about the origins of the book, I suppose. And it came across even as we were reading the excerpt that your kind of learning alongside the reader is really palpable, that you are constantly being quite open, and your sort of thoughts about things quite malleable and open to learning alongside everyone that you're sort of interviewing. So I wanted to know a little bit just about your starting point in terms of your presence in the book. Like, how did you go in and think, what's my presence in this book going to be like? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something I thought about pretty much the whole way through writing. Yeah, so I mean, like, to start with, I really don't like autobiography. Like, I don't like writing about myself. So I knew it was never gonna like be that. But yeah, so I had to sort of think about my own positionality pretty much the entire time that I was writing. And that was, you know, and it changed. Like, I think my own thoughts about my role within the book like changed as I was writing it. Like, as you said, like, I really did learn so much. I mean, even just the introduction of the book, I talk about how, like, you know, like from the start to the finish of writing the book, like I was able to, like, writing this book allowed me to accept myself as an asexual person. Like, okay, actually kind of emotional. Yeah, so I thought really hard about it pretty much the whole way through. And sort of on the topic of, like, you know, balancing like my own perspective with the perspective of other people in the community, which I think is the second half of your question, but you haven't asked yet. So I knew from the start that I wanted to talk to as many people as I could. And I knew that the book was never just going to be about me. Partly because that was what I did with They, Them, There. Like, and I only managed to speak to, like, you know, 10 to 15 people for that book. And this one, I managed to speak in depth to about like 40 people, which like is still not as many as I wanted to. But yeah, so anything that is good or strong about the book comes from the people that I spoke to in writing it. Like, yeah, I really feel privileged that I was able to, like, sort of, like, you know, people are trusting me with their experiences, and I hope that I represented them accurately. But it was weird finding a balance and sort of thinking about what my own role was. And I think I took on multiple roles, you know, like I did have to talk about my own experience, you know, because I have, I'm really rambling. Hope this is entertaining for all of you. Yeah. Like, you know, I have to write about myself because, you know, I don't really have a right to anyone else's, like, there's an intense emotional aspect to the topics that I talk about in this book. And like, while some people I spoke to shared their emotional experience with me, I didn't really feel that I had a right to anyone else's in that way. So I was able to incorporate my own. And, you know, sometimes it was painful, but I feel like it does make the book stronger. But yeah, like, I think that the best thing about this book is the voices, like the other people's voices in it.
Yeah, but the thing is, you are one of those voices. To anyone who's reading, you are one of those voices. And I think like that kind of infuses it with a sense of respect, I suppose, and care. And one of the other things to do with that sort of balance that you were talking about, which I was wondering about, is like if you set out, and that I guess is more to do with research, I suppose. If you set out and you think, I'm going to do these interviews and they're going to be a book, is there ever any tension of like looking for certain things in the interviews, looking for certain answers? And did you have to sort of step back and go, actually?
Yeah, absolutely. Such a balancing act. So writing the book ended up taking about 2 years, which is twice as long as They Them There took. I don't know how I wrote They Them There, actually. I was working full time. I don't know, never again.
The first book magic.
Oh my God, yeah, no social life. Roundabout process writing these voices because so like with the origins of the book, like my publisher JKP, they were so, you know, part of my editor's role was to sort of read the literature that exists right now and think about where there were gaps. And that was one of the things that made the stakes feel so high when I was writing this, because like we were trying to like actively look into places that had not, you know, been visible before, and like, you know, topics that we hadn't seen touched on before. So they gave me a list of topics that they were interested in seeing explored in the book. And I think I managed to touch all of them, but JKP are really good. They gave me a lot of creative control over it. They like, aside from those topics, they didn't really give me like a rigid structure or anything. So what I did was I used those topics to create like sort of interview questions and questionnaire questions. And I was able to give those to they were quite open-ended, and I was able to give those to my participants, my interviewees. Some of whom might be in this room here, at least a couple of whom I know are here. Hi, thank you. So I was able to give those topics to people, and I think the questions were fairly open-ended. And I was able to sort of like let people sit with the questions and then come back to me, you know, in their own time and see where it took them and see, you know, if they wanted to go off on tangents, that was okay. And I was really interested in anything people had to say on those topics. So it really ended up morphing what the book, you know, like I knew from the start, like, I don't want to like shoehorn anything into the book that doesn't actually reflect, you know, us living our lives right now. So it was sort of like, I don't know if it's like abductive analysis or something, where you like go and like you have topics, you like go back and look at the actual data, and then you change your question, and then you go back and look at the, and it's sort of, it was a very roundabout circular process of like I guess like thematic analysis, like sort of looking at the patterns that were emerging, and they didn't always match up to what the list of topics. So I was able to like shape the book much more like closely to what people were actually talking about, what was actually relevant to the people I was talking to.
It sounds like a really creative process, actually, as well. Like to me, it sounds like, you know, writing a novel, or like, you know, it's just not going in with.
I mean, I wish it were. I'm trying to write a novel. I don't know what I'm doing, so it's not.
Well,
really
I mean, that to me it makes a lot of sense. And I wanted to make sure that we had time to go back to talk a little bit about more language. Yeah, which is what the excerpt that you were reading was about. And you know, there's quite a lot in the book about this tension in putting words on things and on feelings and on identity, and the tension between language being restrictive in one sense, but also creating a sense of acceptance, and that feeling of like, if there is a word for it, then it is sort of, it exists, it is okay. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about where you are with it now, having written the book, and if your kind of position within that tension and your thoughts about that tension had changed after writing the book.
Yeah, I think, so I don't even know if language, no, I think language was on the list of topics at the start, but that may just be because my editor, Andrew, knew that I I'm interested in language, so maybe he just included that for my benefit. Because it was something I wanted to talk about. I'm really interested in language, and anything I end up writing has to do with language, because that's where I'm naturally drawn to. But I didn't know what it was. I had no idea how language interacted in the ASPEC community. I had no clue going in what I was going to find, and that was really exciting. And that tension, as that you mentioned, that was one of the most interesting things that came out of writing the book, was exploring this sort of duality that we're always contending with, where language can be quite, it's liberatory, but it can be quite dangerous. And yeah, my thoughts are definitely, it's been a really a learning experience. Yeah, so, and I think when it comes to language, something that, because you have the dictionary, right? And that's, you take our language and then you make it accessible to the reader, whoever they are, right? But I'm less interested in that, and I'm more interested in making our language accessible to each other, right? I want to, insofar as it is useful, give the language to the community. I'm not really interested in explaining what we are to allo people as much. And I think because this book was always going to be by, for, and about us, and I mean, it has ended up being no media outlets are talking about this book. So, but the people in the community are reading it, and I've been so grateful and proud of that. But yeah, so I want to explore the language insofar as it is useful to us. And part of the reason why I don't want to write that dictionary is because I've kind of had this realization since after writing the book, something I realized quite recently was that when you have the burden of explanation, when you place that burden on marginalized people to explain their own experiences, you kind of the conversation ends up sidestepping what I think is the real question, which is, why do we need to explain these identities in the first place? Why are they not understood or known in the first place? So in writing this book, I was really trying to step away from the explainer, the dictionary, and step towards an exploration of what are the larger systems that are acting on us, that cause us to be marginalized, that cause other people to not understand our experiences, or to reject our experiences, or not to be receptive to them. So I tried to, I wish I'd had this realization earlier in the writing process, or during the writing process, but I thought that was quite an important thing to think about.
But I think that there's definitely room for that in the book, because there are contradictions, and that I think is one of the big differences probably with between something like this and a dictionary. Because if you've got a dictionary, then you can say to someone, you are using that word wrong. That is not the right definition of that word, which means someone can say, oh, that is not me, I am wrong, which is not the case here. There's contradictions, and that's
so many contradictions.
that's a really good thing, because it challenges that idea that it's a club and you are not invited. Right. That's what I'm trying to say. We are going to, in a moment, we're going to open up to questions from the audience. So this is just your warning. So in case you've got anything that you're you've got half formulated in your brain, this is the time to turn it into a question, perhaps. But I also wanted to talk about one of my favorite chapters in the book is the one about kind of hierarchies of relationships, and And it led me to think, like, how does this relate to, and I wrote to you about this in an email, sort of like, because I think it's just like it's a huge question. I didn't sort of want to put you on the spot. It had me thinking about why do certain relationships get prioritized above others, and who stands to gain from this was basically my question. It's like there must be vested interests. So it led me to think about, you know, nuclear families. That has to do with individualism, which in turn has to do with consumerism. And I wonder if any of the writing of the book kind of illuminated any of that for you.
Yeah,
So
so
bigger vested interests.
like, absolutely, yes. I love this question. I've been waiting. I was like, I hope we get to this question. So if anybody heard my interview on the Sounds Fake But Okay podcast, I talk about my murder wall that I ended up creating by like with like the red yarn on the corkboard while I was writing the chapter on sort of like medicalization and the sort of ways that you know, colonialism and capitalism have ended up putting marginalized people, colonized people into positions where someone else is controlling their bodily or reproductive agency, and how that kind of plays into asexuality and stuff. I was not able to include the results of the murder wall in the book. I sent it to Andrew, and he was like, "This is insane, please cut this." He didn't say it like that. Someday I'm going to turn it into like a big unhinged essay. But yeah, so there are vested interests. And like, I think that was something that you know, like I had this glimmer while I was writing They Them There, like, oh, it's all the same system. It's capitalism. You know, and then you like sort of like you know, the matrix snaps back into place and sort of your head goes below water again. But I was trying to like lean into that and like look at that. And it's like, it's really hard. I'm not, you know, an academic. Like I don't know about theories. So it was like, it's quite startling and like frightening to realize like, oh my God, this is all the same systems, you know, the things that are oppressing. Yeah, like, yeah.
Yeah, no, it is the moments of just like, oh my God, it's capitalism again.
Capitalism strikes again.
Yeah, definitely. Does anyone have any questions? I have, you know, more, but I want to make sure that people get a chance. Joe? Yes. Should we share this one?
Hey, I was wondering about the title, because in the section on language, you talked about how one respondent had come back with, as an aro person, I'm frustrated by the fact that this has been like prefaced with ace, because it tends to be the case that
this is my public apology to that person.
Yeah, there's like that segment of the community is often not foregrounded in discussions, and hence they like pointed out aspec as a term. And I wondered, like, did you try pitching aspec to JKP, or were you like, it's not going to be widely enough known by people outside our community for them to then be able to pick up the book, whereas at least ace has other meaning words, so you could kind of get away with it?
This was a whole conversation that I had with the folks at JKP, and like this was the point where like me, author, don't know anything about book marketing and reach and like getting the word out to people, and like it was a moment where I had to basically, so we basically reached a compromise that I'm pretty happy with. But like it was pretty much every step of the way. So the book was originally the working title that I had been working from is like a spectrum. So like a dash spec, and they were like, no, it's too complicated. I'm like, yeah, actually, fair enough. But there were like several moments where like they would send me some copy. And like no shade to JKP, like they are so good at what they do. And like they do know the market, and like the reason that this book has any reach is because of them, and I'm like so happy with them. But like they would send me some copy, and I'd be like, okay, but can we add the word aro in here? or like, can we change this to aspec? Does it have to just say asexual? Like, we would sort of like have to go back and forth until we reached a version of whatever marketing copy we were both happy with. So that's like, I'm pretty, and it was a constant process of like, Aro 2, also Aro, put it back in. And they were really good every time. They'd be like, yeah, okay, fixed it. But yeah, that's absolutely something that I have had to navigate as an author. And I think a lot of us, we're writing books within the community right now, is the fact that like ace is the word that the public and the industry recognizes. And it's very interesting, like, to sort of try and navigate it. But yeah, it was a whole conversation I had about that.
The one in the room. There's one online as well. Oh, there's one over here. So we'll do this one. Thank you. So I was wondering, when you were researching your book, if there were any other pieces of media that you found that kind of informed your approach, or vice versa, if there were any gaps that you noticed kind of within the general discourse that you wanted to address with your book.
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, I definitely found, let's see. So part of while I was reading the book, like, I didn't really consume much fictional media while I was reading the book. I think representation is still quite lacking. There's definitely some changes being made. Obviously we've got Alice Oseman and Kevin Dunbowman doing amazing work. And I think, well, part of it actually was that I do have a section in the book on representation in media, but it wasn't necessarily one of the topics that I wanted to approach with the book, because I think there are a lot of people that are doing really good work. So I've got like a list of media. As for books that, I think I ended up as for nonfiction, I got really inspired by a lot of this sort of like radical queer, sort of anti-capitalist writers, like people that are writing in a way that draws together these like systems that are all acting on all of us, and sort of like looks beyond a little bit. So yeah, I got really inspired, and it sort of like really made me want to challenge myself to write something that could, go beyond a little bit, go beyond the explainer. And I don't know, how well I succeeded in that, but like it really gave me the prompting to like try, and to like go as deep as I could within the space that I had. But I can't think of a single book I've ever read right now. So.
We are technically out of time, but seeing as Jay put a question online, I'll just throw it out here. You can have a quick response. Did you discover anything surprising about asexuality from any of the other contributors to the book?
So many things. Yeah, I think, as I said, like, thank you, online person. Thanks for watching. Anything like good or new or interesting about this book is really down to the people that I spoke to who shared their experiences with me. Something I did realize that I think links back to the now I realize we're on the clock. I'm like, is there's a really interesting overlap between the ASPEC and autistic communities. Which is something that I have been sort of like thinking about, what is my own position there? And I don't know, I don't have any answers, but it's this sort of way that Joe, actually, I was listening to an interview that you did with the What the Trans podcast, and you said this amazing, I think I quote you actually in the book, like this amazing like sentence about how like, being both ASPEC and being autistic allowed you to like it empowered you to be comfortable in setting aside and challenging and discarding, systems, social scripts that didn't work for you. And that's such a like power that's one of the things that, like, you know, if we want to approach the ASPEC community from, like, not from a place of lack and not from a place of absence, that's something that we are doing. We are actively rejecting and challenging these sort of like really entrenched systems of the nuclear family, of like gender roles and sexual roles. And that's like so exciting to me, like seeing what we're doing. Yeah, so it was just like discovering these things that people are doing, like writing this book allowed me to discover the positive aspects of what it means to be ASPEC. And like, I'm going to be grateful for that for the rest of my life.
Thank you so much, and yeah, we're really grateful for you for writing it. It's time for us to finish the evening, but there will be a chance to buy some books and to get them signed, I believe, as well. Where's the signing table? It's over there. Okay. So Eris will be signing books over there. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. And just a final round of applause to Eris and to our lovely speakers.
Also want to say thank you so much to Joe and Eris, and to you, Jess. It is an honor to speak to you. Thank you to everybody at Lighthouse and the Roxy. Everybody to JKP, thank you so much. And like, thank you so much to any of my participants who are listening right now, any of my interviewees. The book would not be what it is without you. Thank you.